for the kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Ashutosh and the team for inviting me for this virtual meeting. And I hope my slides are visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'll begin with the talk, and that the talk is about a very important subject, that is diabetes in pregnancy or hyperglycemia in pregnancy. So basically, I'll try and cover this talk under the following headings, beginning with the magnitude of the problem itself, the pathophysiology and implications for hyperglycemia in pregnancy, the classification and the recent changes that have emerged up, the diagnostic criteria for gestational diabetes and the debate surrounding that, the management strategies, and I'll be mainly concentrating on gestational diabetes here, and the postpartum care. So if we see the burden of the problem, we all know that about 1 in 11 adults worldwide have diabetes according to the latest IDF estimates. However, it's also important to note that every 1 in 6 live births globally is affected by hyperglycemia in pregnancy, and the majority of which is due to gestational diabetes. The global prevalence of hyperglycemia in pregnancy is around 16%, and proportion of cases due to gestational diabetes is around 84%. So that's a huge number, and this is something that should be kept in mind as we progress through the talk. The picture is even more concerning in Southeast Asian region, where about 25% pregnancies, or 1 in every 4 pregnancies, affected by hyperglycemia. And in India, we see the crude prevalence of hyperglycemia in pregnancy is around 25%, 85 to 90% of this is GDM. Obviously, the data which comes from tertiary care centers, the prevalence may be higher, and the data which comes from primary or secondary care centers, the prevalence may be a little lower. So what is the pathophysiology of gestational diabetes or hyperglycemia in pregnancy? So here, one important point that emerges out is that the global burden of overweight and obesity, or childhood obesity, is increasing. And at the same time, the age at the time of conception is also increasing. So these are two major risk factors for gestational diabetes. And so there are pre-pregnancy determinants of gestational diabetes or hyperglycemia in pregnancy. So one is important is ethnicity. As a general observation, South Asians are at higher risk for diabetes. They are known to develop diabetes at a lower age and BMI. So our ethnicity is at higher risk. Overweight, obesity, that's a pre-pregnancy determinant for a lady who is conceiving. Then you have advanced age at the time of pregnancy, and the past history of polycystic ovary syndrome or hypertension, which indicates some degree of metabolic dysfunction. So once these women enter into pregnancy, during pregnancy, there are a lot of changes, and these changes are brought about by feto-placental maternal unit, which includes secretion of certain hormone mediators and certain metabolic mediators, which causes increased insulin resistance. And when your compensatory beta cell reserve is not able to keep up with the insulin resistance, there is increase in glucose levels. And simultaneously, there is increase in triglyceride levels and amino acid turnover. And all these three things, glucose, free fatty acids, and amino acids, they are important substrates for fetal growth. And once you see that, there is fetal hyperinsulinemia or excessive insulin production by the fetus, which may cause enhanced fetal growth or macrosomia. So if we see this further, there is a fetal substrate transfer that occurs. This causes fetal hyperinsulinemia, and this may cause macrosomia, and this may lead to this may wait. I'm sorry, just one second. So once you have more fetal substrate transfer and fetal hyperinsulinemia, you tend to have fetal macrosomia. And in case of myocardiopathy that may develop due to uncontrolled hyperglycemia, you can get tissue oxygen consumption and demand mismatch. You get tissue hypoxia, which may lead to increased erythropoietin, polycythemia, and hyperbilirubinemia. You may get stillbirth, perinatal asphyxia, and because of fetal hyperinsulinemia, lung surfactant synthesis may decrease, and this may result in respiratory distress syndrome in the newborn. So if we discuss the maternal and fetal implications of hyperglycemia in pregnancy, these could be divided into short-term and long-term implications. For mother, short-term implications include increased risk for spontaneous abortions, preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, polyhydramnios, cesarean and instrumental delivery, birth trauma, postpartum hemorrhage, and increased risk of infections. And this has been shown through numerous studies. The long-term implications for mother include future risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. On the other hand, in terms of fetal and neonatal risk, you have a short-term risk of increased risk of stillbirth, neonatal deaths, non-chromosomal congenital malformations, being a macrosomic baby, which predisposes you to birth trauma, obstructed labor, uh, brachial plexus injuries, respiratory distress syndromes, neonatal hypoglycemia, polycythemia, and jaundice. So these are all short-term implications for fetus, neonate, or child. And in long term, because of certain epigenetic changes that occur in the hostile intrauterine environment of hyperglycemia, you have fetal programming and imprinting, which lead to future obesity, type 2 diabetes, and CVD. And there is upcoming data which suggests that women with hyperglycemia in pregnancy, if they are especially uncontrolled hyperglycemia in pregnancy, their offsprings are at higher risk for future obesity and type 2 diabetes. So this is something that we should always consider. Moving on to classification of hyperglycemia in pregnancy, now it has become increasingly clear that hyperglycemia in pregnancy is not a homogeneous entity. It's a heterogeneous entity in itself, which includes a milder condition, which is gestational diabetes, and a more severe condition, which is diabetes in pregnancy. Now, diabetes in pregnancy can be further subdivided into a diabetes which is actually present before the start of pregnancy. So, say someone with type 1 diabetes who is conceiving. So, this is pre-existing type 1 diabetes or a pre-existing type 2 diabetes, or a diabetes which is diagnosed for the first time during pregnancy. Either this could be an undiagnosed diabetes which patient was carrying and was never tested but was first tested during pregnancy, or patient was pre-diabetes or at higher risk for diabetes, and due to metabolic stresses of pregnancy develops frank diabetes. This could be type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and the thresholds for diagnosis will be same as in non-pregnant adults, that is 126 or more of fasting plasma glucose and 200 or more of 2-hour plasma glucose. Another entity is gestational diabetes, which is usually diagnosed at 24 to 28 weeks of gestation. So you have diabetes in pregnancy, which comprises about 15 to 20% of all, and gestational diabetes, which is hyperglycemia during pregnancy, but which is not overt diabetes. And this is hyperglycemia, which is first detected during pregnancy. This can occur actually anytime during pregnancy, but most likely after 24 weeks of gestation. Coming on to recommendations for antenatal testing in South Asian ethnicity, there is no doubt that all South Asian women should be universally screened for hyperglycemia in pregnancy, and there is no role for selective screening. Considering that the burden of undiagnosed diabetes is high and there is a rapid increase in the prevalence of undiagnosed diabetes, it is desirable that all women be tested at the first antenatal visit for undiagnosed diabetes. And how you do this first antenatal test, that may actually vary according to the resources you have and the population, the risk of the person. For example, a person who has had previous history of gestational diabetes is having multiple risk factors. You may want to go with a 75-gram OGTT right at the first antenatal visit itself. On the other hand, if you don't have resources or the person is not that high risk, you may use any of the fasting, random, and HbA1c in any combination, whichever is feasible. However, even if these women test negative at the first antenatal visit, all women should be tested at 24 to 28 weeks of gestation for gestational diabetes using a standard diagnostic criteria. Now, what is the standard diagnostic criteria for gestational diabetes, and how these criteria have evolved, and what is the debate surrounding these criteria? So if we go back in history, the first diagnostic criteria for gestational diabetes was suggested by O'Sullivan and Mahan, and these criteria were based on 100-gram oral glucose tolerance test, and these criteria detected women who were at increased future risk for type 2 diabetes. That is, in a non-pregnant state, what is the future risk for type 2 diabetes in women who had hyperglycemia during pregnancy? So these criteria used 4 values, that is 0, 1, 2, and 3 R values, and these were based on glucose which were measured in whole blood and which were measured using non-specific reducing method. So subsequent changes that were made by National Diabetes Data Group and Carpenter-Houston, these subsequent changes were actually based upon the change in methodology from whole blood to plasma. And we know that once you move from whole blood to plasma, there is an increase in the glucose value by 15 to 20%. And the change from non-specific reducing methods to specific enzymatic methods. So there was, once you have specific enzymatic methods, you only measure glucose and not other metabolites, and so there is a decrease in the glucose threshold. So the Carpenter-Couston criteria were finally based on these two changes, and these criteria were actually quite popular till the IADPHG criteria came in. In fact, even in current day, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology recommends the use of Carpenter-Couston criteria. WHO suggested in 1999 a criteria which were based on 2-hour fasting OGTT, and they suggested 2-hour threshold of more than 140 as diagnosis of GDM. However, these criteria were not based on any solid scientific evidence. DIPSI, I'll discuss these in more detail. The Diabetes in Pregnancy Society of India suggested that a non-fasting one-step approach could be used to diagnose GDM using a 2-hour threshold of more than or equal to 140. IADPHG criteria came up in 2010, and these were based on a large perinatal outcome-based study. And these criteria suggested that you use a single 75-gram OGTT fasting one-step approach to diagnose gestational diabetes. These criteria have become quite popular and have now been adopted by various professional bodies, including WHO, Endocrine Society, International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, American Diabetes Association, and Canadian Diabetes Association. However, it's worthwhile to note that ADA and Canadian Diabetes Association still propose the use of alternative strategies, which involves a two-step fasting approach. So the DIPSI criteria, these were based on a non-fasting OGTT, and these criteria were actually praised for their pragmatism because they meant that women do not have to come to fasting state to the center, and this this improves the adherence in general. However, these criteria were based on a single center study which showed 100% sensitivity and specificity compared to WHO criteria, and this study was from Chennai. However, when these criteria were tested in other studies, for example, the study by Dr. Mohan's group as a part of WINGS project, or by Dr. Hiraj's group in Sri Lanka, these criteria were shown to have poor sensitivity. That is, the sensitivity varied between 25 to 40%, which means that you tend to miss out on a large proportion of women with GDM, and which in face of, while pragmatism is important, you also don't want to miss out on a large proportion of women. And why this happens is because you tend to miss out on fasting hyperglycemia. These tests only test non-fasting hyperglycemia in a 2-hour state, and a large proportion of women with GDM actually have been shown to have a fasting hyperglycemia. IADPHG criteria, these were based on perinatal outcomes, a fasting 75-gram OGTT derived on the basis of hyperglycemia and adverse pregnancy outcome study. And these criteria excluded patients with over diabetes in pregnancy, which were previously classified as GDM. So these criteria actually made the classification of hyperglycemia in pregnancy as a heterogeneous one, which includes a milder hyperglycemia, that is gestational diabetes, and a more severe form of hyperglycemia, that is overt diabetes in pregnancy. So the HARPO study led to the formulation of an IADPHG consensus panel, which devised the IADPHG criteria, and which actually divided hyperglycemia first recognized in pregnancy into two broad categories, that is gestational diabetes, when you have a 0-hour glucose of between 92 and 125, a 1-hour glucose of more than 180 milligram per percentage, and a 2-hour glucose of between 153 and 199. And over diabetes in pregnancy, which is hyperglycemia first recognized during pregnancy, but which meets the threshold that you expect in a non-pregnant adult, that is fasting glucose of more than or equal to 126, a 2-hour glucose of more than or equal to 200, and a HbA1c of more than or equal to 6.5%. So we see there are two case studies that I will present in order to make this clear. So this is a 28-year-old who is a primey. Her pre-pregnancy BMI was 26. She has a history of family history of diabetes in her mother. Her preconception tests are normal. She was tested at the first antenatal visit. Fasting plasma was okay. She has gained about 3.5 kgs of weight till 26 weeks, which is okay considering the IOM guidelines. Her 26 weeks period of gestation OGTT shows that her fasting glucose is 98. So she has fasting hyperglycemia as per the IADPHG criteria. 1-hour and 2-hour glucose values are normal, and she can be labeled as having gestational diabetes as per IADPHG criteria. Another lady, she's a 38-year-old female. She has had bad obstetric history. She's in her third pregnancy, has had 2 abortions. Her pre-pregnancy BMI is on a higher side. She has family history of diabetes in both her parents. Reportedly, her preconception tests were normal. She was tested at 11 weeks period of gestation. Considering that she was a high-risk candidate, she underwent a 75-gram OGTT, and these OGTT results were perceived as normal. She was advised to follow with a normal diet. she gained quite a lot. She gained 8 kgs of weight till 28 weeks, which is almost more than the double of what she should have according to her pre-pregnancy BMI. So at her 28 weeks, when her GTT was done, GTT was frankly abnormal. Her fasting glucose was 152, 1 hour was 290, and 2 hour was 266. So this can be labeled as having overt diabetes in pregnancy, because she was detected to have hyperglycemia. This is first time she's detected to have hyperglycemia, but the hyperglycemia is not mild. It meets the threshold of diabetes in non-pregnant. Moving on to the management strategies. Before we move to management strategies, I think the core of management strategy, it's important to understand the recommendations for weight gain during pregnancy that are suggested by institutions of medicine. They are no different for diabetes in pregnancy or hyperglycemia in pregnancy. So you could follow the same recommendations as are followed for any other pregnancy. So if you have a obese pregnancy, the target weight gain is somewhere between 5 and 9 kg. Somebody with overweight category pre-pregnancy BMI, the target weight gain is 7 to 11.5 kg. In a normal weight pregnancy, the target weight gain could be between 11.5 to 16 kg. And the weight gain per week in second and third trimester could vary between 0.22 kg per week to 0.42 kg per week, depending on what your pre-pregnancy BMI is. Moving on to blood glucose targets, we know that blood glucose targets using capillary blood measurement are more stricter in pregnancy, and these have been suggested to be for any women with hyperglycemia in pregnancy. The targets are fasting glucose of less than 95 milligram percentage, a 1 hour postprandial glucose of less than 140, and a 2 hour postprandial of less than 120. However, it should be remembered that these targets should be achieved without causing any undue hypoglycemia to the pregnant mother. And during labor, it is recommended that you should target blood glucose in between 72 and 126 milligram percentage in order to decrease the risk for early neonatal hypoglycemia. The role for glycated hemoglobin, we know that glycated hemoglobin has so many pitfalls during pregnancy, which includes hemodilution, change in the lifespan of RBCs, and so on and so forth. So it's not recommended in diagnosis of GDM. So the diagnosis has to be made based on a 75 gram or OGTT or any other standard diagnostic criteria. In patients with pre-existing diabetes, HbA1c is very important for preconceptional optimization. Generally, we suggest that a preconceptional HbA1c of at least less than 6 to 6.5% should be achieved. In patients who have diabetes in pregnancy, that is the severe form of diabetes or over diabetes or pre-existing diabetes, you have a baseline HbA1c, and this could be used for antenatal follow-up. And in some patients with GDM, where you feel that SMBG records are not very reliable, you could use this to confirm reliability of SMBG records. Other sort of monitoring, it's important to monitor weight, blood pressure, and urine dipstick protein at clinic visits in appropriate clinical settings. Clinical and sonographic assessment of fetal growth, and I think this is important that our teamwork with a trained gynecologist and obstetrician is very important. And the non-stress test and biophysical profile as per the local protocol, and maybe the gynecologist may throw some light on this. So core components, medical nutrition therapy. The goals of medical nutrition therapy is to ensure that you provide to the patient a carbohydrate controlled meal plan, which not only provides adequate nutrition in terms of both micronutrients and macronutrients, it promotes adequate weight gain, it promotes euglycemia, and at the same time you prevent any sort of ketosis, because this is not good for the baby. About 80% patients with gestational diabetes, the standard GDM, will be controlled on medical nutrition therapy alone. And this is very important, and that is why a good nutritional counseling, a good physical activity counseling with the patient is very, very rewarding. A minimum of 1600 to 1800 kilocalorie diet should be prescribed, because it has been seen that if you go on to diet restriction, like less than 1500 to 1600, as you do in a non-pregnant state, there you could end up with ketosis, which has been shown to be harmful for fetal brain development. So you should target about 35 to 45% carbohydrates, good quality carbohydrates. By good quality, I mean low glycemic index carbohydrates, and a minimum of 175 grams per day of carbohydrates is recommended. Major and minor meals in a 3+3 pattern, which indicates 3 major meals and 2 to 4 minor meals or snacks. 30 minutes of dedicated physical activity should be recommended, and then in addition, you have 10 minutes walk after each meal. This is what we advise to each and every patient. So you can start with a 2 weeks trial of diet, physical activity, and review with the self-monitoring blood glucose record. And if you are not achieving the recommended targets, you can up titrate the therapy. In terms of up titration, you have either oral antihyperglycemic therapy or insulin therapy. In terms of oral antihyperglycemic therapy, metformin, there is good safety and efficacy data during pregnancy. In terms of efficacy, metformin therapy is associated with secondary failure rate. About 25 to 45% of patients who require metformin may eventually require insulin. However, there is good data on safety during the pregnancy. Long-term data, the long-term data is still evolving. There are some concerns. There's some data from MIG TOFU trial which shows that uh, patients who have been prescribed metformin during pregnancy, their offsprings have been shown to have higher body weight and higher waist hip ratios. However, these data are again conflicting. The data from metformin versus insulin in gestational diabetes trial, which shows that metformin is quite effective. Data on glibenclamide, as of now, data on glibenclamide shows that fetal outcomes are not favorable, and this is a good systematic review and meta-analysis which has shown that in metformin users compared to glibenclamide users, the glibenclamide results in higher maternal weight gain, higher fetal birth weight, which is higher by about 200 grams, higher incidence of macrosomia, which is more than threefold higher, and higher incidence of large for gestational age babies. So the glibenclamide use has been associated with increased incidence of neonatal hypoglycemia, macrosomic babies, and increased large for gestational age babies. And this was also shown in the insulin Deonil trial, where glibenclamide was not shown to have non-inferiority compared to insulin for the primary outcome, that is macrosomia, neonatal hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia. So as of now, glibenclamide is not a preferred choice of therapy for treatment of women with hyperglycemia. Coming on to insulin therapy, you could use a short-acting form of insulin, which includes regular insulin, aspart insulin, or the recently introduced Fiasp, the Lispro insulin, or long-acting insulin therapy in form of a neutral protamine, hagedorn insulin, or detamir insulin. It's important that you sit with the patient, explain correctly the insulin technique, appropriate sites, the rotation, how to maintain a blood glucose record, and hypoglycemia prevention and management. Patients may be very apprehensive, but detailed counseling is actually very helpful. Consistent insulin meal timings, consistent quality and quantity of diet should be emphasized. And you may actually start with 1 or 2 doses of short-acting insulin if you feel that glucose excursion is related to only 1 or 2 meals. So it's not always that you need to start with 4 doses of insulin. You may start with 1 dose of insulin at the time of maximum glucose excursion, and then you can build up. When should you consider insulin therapy upfront? So insulin therapy should be considered upfront, that is as a first line of therapy in patients where you feel that oral hyperglycemic therapy is likely to fail. So these are candidates such as candidates in which diagnosis of hyperglycemia is at less than 20 weeks. So these are women who are likely to have more progression and are ultimately likely to require insulin therapy. If there is need for pharmacological therapy at more than 30 weeks, this is also an indication for upfront insulin therapy. If you have fasting plasma levels of more than 110 or 101 hour plasma levels of more than 140, these patients are unlikely to get controlled with oral therapy alone. And patients who have excessive pregnancy weight gain of more than 12 kgs, again, they are more likely to require upfront insulin therapy. So this is a typical sort of self-monitoring blood glucose record, which we encourage our patients to follow. We ask the patients to follow a staggered blood glucose log where they measure paired glucose readings around a given meal. And so they do this intermittently. They are advised to do a 3 a.m. monitoring, and also very importantly record remarks for any aberrant glucose value, because otherwise if they don't record this remark, you may find variability, and you may actually go on increasing insulin, regular insulin at this point in time. However, if there is an appropriate remark, you know why this actually happens. And it's also important to look at patterns. It's not that always you need to adjust the dose. For example, in this patient, there is an increase in blood glucose between breakfast and before and after breakfast. However, there is a dip subsequently, and this is because the patient is consuming all the calories in the breakfast and not taking any midday snack. So if you divide the breakfast, and you see that the peak has flattened, and you get a more flatter trajectory, and there is actually no need for increasing insulin or decreasing any sort of insulin out. Coming on to timing of delivery, most authorities would recommend delivery by 38 to 39 weeks period of gestation, and these are Western guidelines. I know you need to individualize these to our country. However, if you have a patient who is very well controlled and the estimated fetal weight is not more than 3800, you can actually continue up to 41 to 40 weeks, 40 to 41 weeks or up to term. However, if you see that the diabetes is not very well controlled, or there are vascular disease or previous history of poor fetal outcomes, you should try and induce delivery by 38 to 39. Postpartum care, and this is something that we are actually interested in, and we as a research group do a lot of work on postpartum care and gestational diabetes. This just to put in perspective that women with gestational diabetes are at huge increased future risk of type 2 diabetes by about 10 times, and this was shown in a recent systematic review and meta-analysis, which showed that the risk for future type 2 diabetes is actually highest in during first 5 years, where the risk is actually 17-fold higher, and then it comes down to say by 10 times higher in between 5 to 10 years, and about 9-fold higher between more than 10 years. So you need to intervene, and you need to intervene early. That's the message that comes out from this RCT, from this meta-analysis. I'm sorry. And postpartum glucose intolerance, it is recommended that you do a testing for postpartum glucose intolerance in all women who had a previous history of gestational diabetes. The recommendations may vary, but most recommendations uh, uh, suggest that you should go with a 2-hour 75-gram OGTT between 6 to 12 weeks period of gestation in all women. So all women should undergo a 2 hours GTT at 6 to 12 weeks, and the classification should be based on non-pregnant WHO criteria. Those women who are detected to be normal, they should not be left alone. They need to be followed up at every 1 to 3 year interval with a HbA1c, fasting plasma glucose, or a 75-gram OGTT. Now, do all women require OGTT in postpartum state? And this was something that we looked up, especially considering the pandemic that emerged. The OGTT, which involves long waiting time of 2 hours, which becomes uncomfortable for patients. So these were the data that we generated based on 377 women who were followed up after their GDM pregnancy, about 15 months after their delivery. And all these women underwent a 75-gram OGTT for the diagnosis of pre-diabetes, diabetes, or normoglycemia. And then on the basis of gold standard GTT, what we extrapolated was that if you use a fasting plasma glucose threshold of more than 110 or HbA1c of more than or equal to 6%, in order to proceed for the OGTT, you actually do not miss the diagnosis of diabetes in any women, and about only 1 in 5 women will require OGTT. So if you use fasting and HbA1c thresholds as was suggested in this study, only 1 in 5 women will actually require OGTT, and 4 in 5 women do not require OGTT. And other strategies which you could use include strategy of using a fasting threshold of more than 100 or HbA1c threshold of more than 5.7%. However, OGTT will be required in a larger proportion in these cases. The data on postpartum conversion of diabetes is actually not homogeneous, and the South Asian flavor is again reflected here, and this has been shown in the Atlantic DIP study, which is a Caucasian based data including Irish women, where they found that abnormal glucose tolerance was seen in 26% of women at a postpartum duration of 2.6 years. In the HARPO study follow-up at a postpartum duration of 11.4 years, abnormal glucose parameters were seen in 52.2% women. And this was a study that we performed in a 267 women with GDM who were of North Indian ethnicity. We found that at a very low postpartum interval and at a lower mean age and a lower mean BMI, the postpartum conversion rates were actually quite high. So this again reinforces the fact that South Asian phenotype is little different from the Western phenotype. The South Asian women are at higher risk for future diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and the follow-up strategies in these women need to be very stringent. For postpartum follow-up, we can summarize the postpartum follow-up under this ABCDE approach, which includes assessment, that is assessment for glucose and other metabolic parameters at regular interval. Important to emphasize breastfeeding, because it has been shown that not only breastfeeding helps to reduce maternal weight and reduce maternal risk for future obesity and diabetes, it has also been shown that apart from the usual sort of benefits that breast milk provides to the infant, it has also been shown that breastfeeding may decrease the risk for future obesity and diabetes. And there is some gut microbiome alterations which have been postulated, that favorable gut microbiome that breast milk introduces, that may reduce the future risk for diabetes. Contraception is very important, that the two pregnancies in a women with GDM are planned adequately so that metabolic parameters are adequately controlled before women conceives. This helps to ensure adequate or optimal pregnancy outcomes. And diet and exercise, this is something which is very important. And this is something which should be emphasized while you are talking to the patient during pregnancy itself. It should be emphasized that the efforts at diet and exercise that are being made during pregnancy need to be continued in the postpartum period as well. So the take-home messages from this talk are that hyperglycemia in pregnancy is associated with poor maternal and neonatal outcomes, both in short and long term. It's no doubt that every woman should be tested for hyperglycemia in pregnancy and should be tested to exclude over diabetes at first antenatal visit. Each pregnant woman should be tested for GDM at 24 to 28 weeks of gestation. In terms of diagnostic criteria, there is increasing acceptance for IDPHE criteria universally. However, some criteria should be used rather than no criteria. Medical nutrition therapy is adequate for GDM management in about 80% of cases, and this should be carefully discussed with the patients. Oral anti-hyperglycemic drugs or insulin may be given if blood glucose targets are not met after 2 weeks of MNT. However, there are certain candidates who require upfront insulin therapy. And each woman with GDM should be followed up after delivery using an approach of assessment, emphasis on breastfeeding, contraception, and diet and exercise. So I'll stop here, and I'll thank you all for